This year's NBA Finals and playoffs in general have felt a bit underwhelming. Even in the last few years, the playoffs have felt pretty lackluster. Why is this, and will the NBA ever recover? Luckily, there's no need to panic. No, the NBA isn't dying, and no, it's not the end of interesting basketball. The cold hard truth is that we just came out of an era that had established stars like LeBron, Curry, KD, and many more. These stars made a name for themselves while fairly young. In turn for showing so much promise, they essentially had their teams, and the league in general ran around them for a long time. Teams had to create the best team possible around their stars, and even plan to create super teams. These teams were around long enough to have multi-year and even decade-long storylines that became super interesting as they went on. But nothing lasts forever, especially in sports. As these players who ran the league for a decade or more are starting to age out of the game, it's becoming evident that we are now in a transition era. Something that happens in the cycle of the NBA after dynasties rise and then fall. Let's look back into recent history for proof. The Bulls had just run the 90s with all the storylines, all-time moments, and tense playoff series you could think of. They had to go up against many deadly teams that had been building just as long as them. Everyone knows the 90s was a stacked basketball era with multiple great teams that got held down by Jordan being just a little more great. After the Bulls' era of dominance came a quick three-peat and collapse from the Lakers in 2000 to 2002, and by the 03 season, most of these teams that had built up over the 90s were either completely destroyed or dying a slow and sad death. This led to a transition era, seem familiar, where no team was guaranteed to win anything, and a lot of the players like LeBron, KD, and many more began to enter the league and eke out a name for themselves while still young. These young players started making big playoff runs in their young 20s and actually directly outcompeted the vets that they had to go up against not long into their careers. This obviously can be directly compared with this era. We're only a few years into this transition era, and we have an average age of around 24 years old for the main stars of teams that made the quarterfinals this year. That's a big jump from the near 30-year-olds we saw duke it out in the LeBron and Golden State era. Let's go over these playoffs for some further proof that we truly are in a transitionary period. To start with, every single team that was filled with vets near or above 30 as their main star or full core absolutely ate shit this year, and I don't really care what excuses you make for them. These teams looked just a bit too old and hobbled to compete with the younger players that ended up torching them. Starting with the Heat, Jimmy Butler simultaneously breathes life into that team and kills it. The team is built around the crucial role of him being the guy, yet he can't stay on the court for anything important recently. At 34 years old, this was supposed to be Jimmy's last shot to finally get that dark horse ring he's been coveting, but they got 4-1 by the Celtics in the first round. The next team to hone in on is the Clippers. This team looks like it would be the favorites and not lose a single game if it were 5 years ago. Sadly, just like Jimmy Butler, a lot of these guys can't even stay on the court for anything anymore. When they actually do end up playing, it's getting more and more mid every time we watch them. This mishmash of old men playing basketball isn't winning a single chip. Their time has passed. Moving on to the Phoenix Suns, this supposed super team was supposed to be the last gasp of life for the old guard that inhabit the team. KD and Beal just aren't KD and Beal anymore. This team looked absolutely pathetic as they got ripped a new one by a much younger Minnesota. KD isn't an ISO god anymore, and Beal can barely move compared to what he used to be able to do. Also, to be honest, the young gun of the team, Devin Booker, is a complete fraud. The young players with a few years of experience under their belts really made a statement this year. We can only expect this avalanche of youth to keep gaining speed as well. LeBron and the boys aren't getting any younger. As mentioned earlier, the cycle is repeating, and we're seeing a number of new players step up to take those spots at the top for the next decade or so.
As fans, we've come out of a pretty blessed era, seeing future Hall of Fame players like LeBron, Kevin Durant, Steph Curry, James Harden, and so on fully hit their prime, create legendary games, series, and also teams, which may have spoiled us just a little bit. And because of all of this, it's kind of created a players dominant league. meaning as we've seen more talent and more stardom emerge, it's given players the freedom to dictate their own situation more often than not. Something that allowed way for KD's move to Golden State or James Harden's move to Brooklyn, Philly, and then LA. This meant that we were continuously getting fresh looks to teams and pairings that would keep fans hooked into the postseason. But quickly, that starts to have negative consequences, as sometimes a player-dominant league means that true team development can go out the window, which really is something that is essential to winning a championship in an era filled with talent. As talent can really only get you so far until you need another factor to push you over that edge. Looking at this from a fan standpoint can also kind of show you how these quickly formed super teams have a negative effect on the product of the NBA. Looking at a lot of the series and games that are considered all-time legendary series or games, one thing that really makes them interesting is the team rivalries. And when you have these quick shifting super teams that can form and break up in a matter of 3 years, you don't really have enough time to develop a rivalry. And of course, I don't need to tell fans why rivalries make things more interesting. But even from a player's standpoint, we've seen in even the recent era how rivalries can bring the best out of players and teams. Even though we watched the Cavs and the Warriors battle it out for 4 finals in a row, they were all memorable series. Mostly because the level that each player went to, truly leaving it all out on the floor and creating all-time moments. And without the Warriors truly suffering through the tough times as a team and developing together, we may have never have gotten those series, proving from both a team and a fan standpoint how team development does help the overall product. So before you complain about having to see the Pacers or the Orlando Magic in the playoffs, remember that it is important to the product, which kind of leads into the next point. You need to give teams and players time to develop. Like I mentioned, we are leaving an era as LeBron, KD, Curry, and that class of stars get closer and closer to retirement. And through this, we've seen teams who spent the last few seasons in NBA purgatory stewing around the middle or bottom of the standings now making a major push to propel themselves higher into the standings. Teams like the OKC Thunder and the Orlando Magic. The through line for both of those teams is building and allowing those teams to grow together. The Thunder brought in SGA, but for the most part they have done amazingly through the draft while piecing together the rest of the team. Of course, they did also just pull off that finesse bringing in Caruso for Giddey without having to give away any picks, so again, another pretty genius move. Also, as it stands right now, they probably will need to make a trade to bring in some size and rebounding to truly take advantage of the team that they have right now. But for the most part, what the Thunder are doing should be proof that if you build together, it's possible to go from a sub 500 team to the 2nd seed in your conference in only 1 year without adding any major pieces to the trade market. So for some fans, it may seem boring to watch the Pacers be one of the teams in the conference finals, but they should note that the stars they grew up watching are slowly becoming less dominant forces in the league. And soon, players like Ant, SGA, Luka, and even Halliburton will be running the league. But for now, the reason a team like the Pacers were able to make it into the conference finals was because of their team development and the lack of some other team's cohesion. And also Dame and Giannis being injured, that does kind of help too. So be patient, let these young guys have their struggles and build together, and eventually you will get those historic matchups that you were used to in the 2010s. But another thing that could make these past playoffs seem, again, quote unquote boring, is because of the massive blowouts we've seen. Of course, over the last 10 years or so, there has been an overall explosion in total points scored, being the 2nd highest decade in scoring behind the 60s, who did have Wilt Chamberlain averaging 50 points, and Elgin Baylor being not too far behind him with a 38-point season. So that could maybe explain things, but the reason for the latest explosion in scoring can mostly be chalked up just to Steph Curry. Right now in the NBA, we have players being drafted that watch Steph completely shift the NBA and culture with the 3-point shot. So naturally, the 3-point shot is fully in its peak. This season across the NBA, teams averaged about 35.5 3-point shots a game, when just 5 years ago there was only 2 teams in the NBA that averaged more than 35 attempts a game. And we've seen how much the 3-point shot has impacted the game, making massive double-digit leads seem less daunting than they used to be. But also making those same leads a lot more possible if the other team just isn't shooting the 3 ball well. Some fans have said after these finals concluded that the past couple of seasons have been pretty unmemorable, probably because of the reasons listed. Older players you grew up with are aging and not making the playoffs, while younger players are growing with their teams and because of their age and inexperience aren't playing at the same level of basketball we became accustomed to over the 2010s. That going hand in hand with the severe lack of rivalries coming from the lack of long-term competitive teams, thanks to the player-dominant league that is slowly fading away, is a pretty bad concoction. But the good news with all of that being is, if you're just a little patient, you'll soon see those same rivalries and league-leading stars pop up all over the place, as teams like the Timberwolves, Thunder, Magic, Grizzlies, and so on continue to grow and get experience. But the final problem that I want to mention isn't something that any NBA team or player can control, and that is actually how we as the fans are being presented the playoffs. Think back to any series in the early 2010s and before that, and the hype that surrounded those events, the player introductions, or the cool court designs incorporating the Larry O'Brien trophy behind each team logo. But now, instead of a cool court design, they digitally place about 15 YouTube TV ads, and instead of hype player introductions, we're left hearing JJ Redick spew off Twitter takes, or Doris Burke talk about her undying love for Jason Tatum, before immediately switching to 15 more State Farm or Michelob Ultra commercials. So no matter how you feel about the actual game itself, how we as the fans at home are being presented that game is undisputably 100 times worse. Not to mention the fumble of losing inside the NBA, and now we're just being left with ESPN for the most part, who might let a top tier analyst like Tim Legler go, but will keep a guy on like Kendrick Perkins, who says a take, then immediately has to walk it back the next day when he's proven wrong. Hopefully Adam Silver is listening to fans when it comes to this and is trying to find better ways to present the product. But either way, if you have somewhat felt the NBA playoffs for a past couple of seasons has felt a little boring and unmemorable, just look at it as the calm before the storm. If you made it this far, give the video a like. While you're down there, you might as well just subscribe and let us know in the comments how you've been feeling about the NBA playoffs in this year's finals. And as for that, we'll see you next week for the next upload.